Welcome to our second lecture on the topic of the macro environment. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to the first, I'd suggest you go back and listen to that before listening to this, because what we've done in that, through exploring the strategic dilemma and essential elements of the business environment, that sets the framework and context leading into our analysis, which is going to be our core theme of this topic. And as you can see here, we are going to look at approaches to analysing the macro or external environment, as we call it, and use a very simple framework called PESTLE, which is widely used in organisations. So let's just go back a bit and revisit the macro environment, which is this blue outer ring. And as we can see here, and as we said, they are broad factors affecting and impacting many businesses globally. Now, why is it essential to analyse and understand the context? Because they do have a significant impact. The changes in this macro environment can often seem too big, complex, or unpredictable for managers to grasp. And the result is that the change that creeps up on the organisation is often too late to avoid threats or take advantages or opportunities. So, as you'll recall from our business environment context in 2.1 lecture, we talked about how the external environment allows us to look at the opportunities and threats facing our organisation. And if we're not sufficiently monitoring the changes, we can have strategic dilemmas and strategic failure. And so many traditional retailers, banks and newspapers were slow to seize the opportunities of the internet. They either weren't tech savvy, or they didn't have the resources or the resources and capabilities internally. And so that allowed those competitors with those resources and capabilities to gain a real strategic advantage. We also look at oil and steel producers, underestimating the potential impact of economic growth slowing down in key markets, for example. And so realistically, I mean, managers are always liable to cognitive bias or inertia and slow to respond. But what we're going to do is, it's important that we minimise the threats, seize the opportunities. And we're going to be looking at PESTLE factors according to 6 key types. Why is it important to analyse the macro environment? Well, it's dynamic. We've got to be agile enough to respond to the changes. And so by analysing the environment, this is a critical part of our strategic diagnosis. The analysis of it enables the business to have real-time data and valuable information to help make informed decisions, facilitates long-term planning. It allows us to forecast the potential threats and therefore put in place measures to control it and identify opportunities to capitalise on. So that's by developing your global mindset, the regular habit of delving in, monitoring your business news, industry news, etc., is critical. So, for example, I love tracking what's happening in technology, given the rapid evolution of that, and specifically disruptive technology, which significantly alters the nature of business and industries and shifts competitive advantage from one organisation to another. And boy, are we seeing that with some of the big mega players globally. You know, you look at back in the 90s, 2000s, it was the FANGs. Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, for example, and now, of course, it's AI, OpenAI, it's ChatGPT, it's Saurus, it's just rapidly advancing. And so when we get this disruptive technology, for example, it can appear suddenly without warning. It's usually independent of an industry as well as the organisation, and gives those that are agile enough to adopt disruptive technology an immediate competitive advantage. So, for example, in Australia, the National Broadband Network was rolled out, and that significantly disrupted competitiveness in the Australian telecommunication industry. It seriously challenged the competitive position of Telstra, which was previously the dominant provider, and Telstra was forced to react by dividing its operations into two separate businesses in order to remain competitive. Some organisations might increase their competitiveness through acquired technology. Let's think about legal. I love looking at what's happening in the legal conditions around the world, because often they're connected to political conditions. So again, thinking about environmental legislation, the Australian government's decision to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, which is an agreement on reducing carbon emissions, that ultimately resulted in carbon credit and carbon tax schemes. And we're still having that debate about, some countries withdrawing from the agreement, others, and is it really effective? So in that case, organisations that had started to work to reduce their carbon emissions were advantaged relative to those that had not identified this environmental factor and not taken any action. So that leads us into the framework that we're going to apply, the PESTEL. This is as you can read here, a strategic tool that's commonly used by businesses and organisations. So that's why we are introducing you to it, and many of you will be familiar with it and already adopting it in various forms. So what this simple framework allows us to do is to assess and analyse environmental factors that impacts particularly our operations and decision making. And by examining the 6 specific factors, businesses can gain a better understanding of the external or macro forces and trends that may affect their industry. And that way, we may reduce our strategic dilemma, because we've got fantastic information to be able to develop strategies to adapt to the particular element and the force of it, or capitalise on it. So, for example, a legal environmental force trend of increasingly tough corporate governance responsibility regulations may provide an opportunity for a business with a sophisticated corporate governance system when seeking capital and investments for its future development. And under these conditions, lending organisations or capital markets may favour customers with strong corporate governance systems. Let's have a look at it in detail. What are the benefits of applying a PESTEL analysis? Well, it helps with contingency planning. We can better anticipate management of threats. So some processes of that are force field analysis, it might be scenario planning, and so on. It allows us to exploit the opportunity. So if we go back to our strategic dilemma, do we exploit or do we focus on our core business? I've already mentioned scenario planning, which is focused strategic planning looking at various scenarios and the impact on your business. It's got increased chances for business continuity during unforeseen disasters. Now, they're not always natural, like tsunamis, bushfires, typhoons, hurricanes, etc. Could be a political crisis or disaster with sudden change of government or community reprisal against the government. It could be geopolitical, where there's tension between countries. Could be economic, could be socio-cultural, where we need to understand the cultural norms and values of the societies in which we are living. It also helps us make strategic choices about innovation and adaptation. As I said, monitoring tech advancements. And then finally, governance and compliance. So the PESTEL framework categorises the external element into 6 factors. Sometimes you might see this as a PEST, PEST, or steeple. They're mainly just these simplifying the core elements. So let's look at P, political. Now this is just a very short list of examples, but you can see it can be fiscal or financial policy. It might be government activity. Could be conflicts and help that it's giving with geopolitical partners, for example. It could be tax, inflation, setting those fiscal regulations. E is for the economy, so gross domestic profit, GDP. It could be employment rates, exchange rates, inflation rates, income level. Because the income level then has a flow-on effect to social or society, the demographic variables. So that can be on age, gender, race, background, disposable income, discretionary income, etc. It's also to do with our cultural factors, religion, lifestyle, education. T is for technological. So what's our access to the technology that we need to be able to compete in our market? What are the technological disruptions that are happening? What are the tech trends? So, you know, the Internet of Things, IoT, was a huge tech disruptor. And now, of course, we're very much into the AI space, and the advancements in that are developing so rapidly. Those that got in early and were able to develop their algorithms and get all their consumer data and build big databases and whatever have a huge advantage over those that were late adopters of that. What research is happening in technology? And of course, with AI, there's the big ethical debate now about how far do we push it. I was listening to a podcast this morning about if AI and robots, etc., become our slaves. So they're already doing this in folding laundry, for example. So a lot of gig economy workers, low wage income earners, jobs are going to perhaps be taken over, but just the finesse and the folding was exactly the same care that we would do. But once they become our say servants, I hate that word, but doing these work, it may have a negative effect then if they take it too far and start adopting human characteristics. So we've got to monitor the research, what's happening. I mean, you've only got to look in China at the moment, that's very technologically advanced, and all the barista capabilities that it's developing. So coffee shops now, well, I mean, we've had, you know, digitized coffee for a while, but these are very sophisticated. So that whole market and industry is going to be disrupted technologically. We were talking in our first topic about the electrical vehicle and how General Motors was convinced that the EV would never work in auto manufacturing. Didn't either have the knowledge or the persistence. It certainly had done some research on it, but didn't take up the opportunity. And then what are the technology trends? E for environment. So what are the environmental policies such as carbon emissions we were talking about a minute ago? What's recycling and all that, waste minimisation for our production processes? What are our consumption trends? Recycling, natural risks, etc. And then legal, L, the last one, laws about minimum wages, worker rights, job security, regulations of foreign workers, skilled migrants, etc., control of marketing. So this is just, there's many examples you could put in there, and you've got to think about when you are looking at these, they're only indicative issues. When these examples were built, we were in a different context, a different business and global environment to what we are now. So you've got to think deeply politically. So here's some more examples. P for politics, political stability, corruption, foreign trade policy, trade restrictions. There's some other examples. E for economic, the growth, exchange rates, unemployment. S for social, population growth rate. So we know in Australia, Japan, Singapore, for example, it's negative population growth rate. So there's going to be increasing reliance on foreign workers and skilled migrants to make up that shortfall. They're also ageing populations. What are the attitudes towards career? What's the emphasis on workplace safety or worker safety? How health conscious are we? What's our lifestyle attitudes at the moment? If we look at T for technology again, other examples here are level of innovation, automation, and how aware are you about technology? E for environment. So we've talked about weather, climate policies, pressure from non-government organisations. So with social media now and the power of influencers, if you're not being environmentally responsible, you will very quickly be called out as a business. So what is the focus of the protesters at the moment? And then legal, some other examples. Discrimination laws, antitrust, business laws, employment, consumer protection, copyright, health and safety. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And as we can see on the right here, each category can be further subdivided. Now, some of these subcategories are going to be weighted more heavily depending on the industry or the organisation. But globally, you need to analyse what are some of the key factors happening globally that's affecting all businesses. And then when I look at that very closely, I then think about which ones are affecting my industry, my business, and therefore which one can I have an opportunity on, take the opportunity and an advantage, or which one is going to be a potential threat. So you think about in times of crisis, so environmental crisis like we had, who took the opportunity very quickly once a global pandemic was announced by the World Health Organization? Well, it was those companies and businesses that could quickly manufacture high volumes of face masks and other personal protective equipment. It was those that could very quickly develop portable and accessible isolation infrastructure or units within that to isolate the unwell. So depending on your industry, every disaster presents both an opportunity and a threat. So every political, environmental, social, technological, economic, legal factor you've got to assess. Is this an opportunity or a threat to my industry and business? Here's just some examples, and go to chapter 2 in the Whittington and have a deeper dive into this. So if we're looking at political element, it highlights the role of the state and other political factors. And there are two important steps in political analysis. First, you have to identify the importance of them and then think about the political risk. So if we look at the role of the state, so you can see up here on the top of this axis, we've got direct state involvement. In many countries and sectors, the state is the often most important as a direct economic actor. For instance, either as a customer, supplier, owner, or regulator of business. And then we've got political exposure. And what we mean here is exposure to civil society. So that's a whole range of organisations that are liable to raise political issues, such as lobbyists, campaign groups, social media, traditional media. So, for example, if you're in the defence industry, as we can see in this top left quadrant, we have high direct state involvement and high political exposure. So the defence industry faces a highly politicised environment because they have high direct state involvement. So National Armed Services are key customers. States are often owners of their national defence companies, and they're highly exposed to groups from campaigners and civil society against, for example, the international arms trade in military in general. Now, opposite to that, in contrast, the food industry has low direct state involvement, pardon me, and low political exposure because most food companies are privately owned and they operate in private sector markets. However, the political environment is still important for food companies as they are typically exposed to pressures from civil society in the form of fair trade, labour rights, health lobbying groups. We then have direct state involvement but low political exposure to the canal industry. So canals are often state-owned. So if you think of England, for example, or any riverway or whatever, any industry that does that can easily be monitored by security agencies, national security agencies, so they place companies such as Amazon, Facebook under scrutiny. And so opposite that is the hotel industry, which has low political exposure and low direct state involvement because, again, it is private industry owned, private sector owned. It obviously has rules and regulations that are mandated by political legislation, but it's in a totally different position to the food industry, defence industry, canal industry. So questions you might ask when you're analysing P for political is how stable, what are the local taxation policies, what are the political trade agreements, what are the foreign trade regulations, what are the social welfare policies. We move on to economic factors. What's the impact of the economy on business? What are the current and forecasted interest rates? We've talked about inflation. What's it forecast to be? We've talked about local employment levels and how they're changing. What are the long-term prospects of the economy for gross domestic product per capita and exchange rates? And so what we're seeing is that these macro environment elements impact business, but they're generally beyond direct control. So all businesses would have impact of these economic factors. Socio-cultural factors. So socio meaning social, cultural meaning diversity, diverse characteristics and so on. What are the local lifestyle trends? Is it a monocultural society or is it multicultural like Australia? What are the current demographics? Are they changing? What's level and distribution of education and income? What's the level of consumerism, spending patterns and attitudes toward it? What pending legislation is there that affects corporate social policies such as partner benefits, maternity, paternity leave? Final example there, what are the attitudes towards work and leisure? Technology, the impact of it, the internet, smartphones, connectivity, automation and that. And so the critical elements here is research funding, government and industry's level of interest and focus on technology, how mature is the technology, what's the status of intellectual property. We've talked about disruptive technologies and if they're in adjacent industries, does that mean there's potential for creeping in and having boundary blurring at the edge of the focal industry? And we'll be looking at that in a later lecture. Pace of change and what role does technology play in providing competitive advantage? Moving on to environmental, we can also look at the impact of environmental and ecological. Is there a scarcity of resources? Recycling, alternative energy. What are the local environmental issues in markets that you want to do business in? And are there any that are relevant in your industry that are pending, such as that Kyoto Agreement, for example, with the carbon emissions tax? What about international pressure groups? And do you have to accommodate them in your strategic planning? Are there environmental protection laws? And so PETA there is PETA is the largest animal rights organisation in the world. So it's People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, more than 3 million members and supporters. They're a formidable group that can very much disrupt industries and business if they feel that you're not affording appropriate governance and compliance and respect. So then for legal, this is around contracts, laws, intellectual property rights. What are the regulations regarding monopolies, if private property? And so the ability to do business or own property in foreign markets is often constrained by a lot of legal factors. Does the IP, intellectual property, have legal protections? Are there relevant consumer laws? What is the status of employment? Now, you'll come up with your own important questions, but these are just examples of the type of analysis you do when we are looking at the impact of the law on business in general. So legal issues form an important part of the institutional environment of an organisation, by which is meant the formal and informal rules of the game, for example. So therefore, in legal, it's not only the overarching macro examples and elements, we've got to look also at the institutional environment when we're thinking about formal laws and regulations that impact our industry. So regardless of the law, there are fairly explicit social values regarding proper respect for the ecological environment. And as I said, you run the risk of running the gauntlet and outrage among consumers or employees, whatever the legal situations, if you're not compliant. And so there can be formal and informal rules that vary sufficiently between countries. So you've got to think about then, from our analysis of our macro or external environment, we need to look at what's the local approach to capitalism in each country and the extent to which it favours particular kinds of businesses and strategies. So even though this is a very simplistic framework, it's really just the starting point. Let's look at an old example of the FANGs, as they're called. So Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google have been around for decades, and now they're almost becoming redundant. They've been usurped by a lot of other what were at the time disruptive technologies. So let's have a look at the opportunities for this industry sector. So government partnerships, so politically, economically, there's new growth regions and capacity to diversify. And technologically, new technologies are allowing them to have both a competitive advantage and also continue to adapt and build the functionality and capacity of their particular technology applications. But let's look at the threats. There's a lot of political hostility, and privacy and use of private data has been a huge discussion over recent years, and political hostility about, a small number of players capitalising and making mega billions out of public data, basically. In developed economies, there's actually world saturation. Society now is wanting a digital detox. Technology, there's now a lot of substitutes out in the marketplace. Environmentally, there's fears and negative attitudes towards the amount of energy consumption that these applications make. And legally, there's increasingly online taxation and data constraints. Now you think about it, if you were looking at opportunities, there's 3, versus all these threats, how attractive would this industry be for you to invest in? So you look at it, here's high, and look, we've got political hostility, developed world, saturation, online, data constraints, moderate to high threats. And then we've got moderate society changes and attitudes. We've got emerging substitutes and energy fears. Versus 3 opportunities. So if I was making a strategic choice about would I invest in or be a new entrant into this industry, it would be a firm no. And so what we've done in this topic is actually introduce you to a variety of concepts and frameworks for analysing each of the pestle factors and the macro environment in general. So as you can imagine, analysing these factors together with their interrelationships, because one impacts and influences the other, can produce a long and complex list of issues. What we'd recommend is don't get overwhelmed by the multitude of details. It's necessary to step back to identify the key drivers for change in a particular context. And these key drivers for change are those factors likely to have a high impact on industries and sectors and the success or failure of strategies within them. And then these key drivers then translate macro environmental factors to the level of the specific industry or sector, as we are seeing here. So the opportunities are new growth regions. So I might go and explore emerging economies, see what their tech infrastructure is with these new technologies. So that could be an opportunity. And very quickly looking at forming government partnerships that I might be able to enter these new growth regions. But if I was looking at entering the developed world economy locations, I would absolutely not. So that's a simple framework for introducing you to core elements of the macro environment. And I'd encourage you to read further on it, think about different examples for each element. When you're reading the business news, think about the pestle list and think about, okay, with that business article, is that an opportunity or a threat for business? And which of the pestle factors does it belong to? Because it's important on where we then project our strategic interests. It's also what will then help us analyse the opportunities and threats for our industry and then for our own business. So what are some key insights? So analysing the macro environment requires constant monitoring of changes, essential for strategic success and to minimise the strategic dilemma that we explored in our first set of themes. A simple framework such as pestle helps us gain a better understanding of forces and trends in our external environment across 6 key factors. What other key insights have you gained about the external or macro environment? What do you still have questions about? So before next class, go to Canvas and prep the resources, continue expanding your mind and global mindset through your readings and the all-important assessments. Thanks for listening.